Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Okay, Afnan. Inshallah, here I'm going to summarize to you what we talked about in class. The first thing we talked about here is basically the definition between anatomy and physiology. You have to kind of know the difference between these two terms, anatomy and physiology, and it's pretty easy to understand. Let me give you an analogy. Anatomy is kind of like what a car is made of, the parts of a car. So there's the wheel, there's the exhaust system, there's the engine, there's the windshield wipers, etc. Physiology is how the car works. How does the engine work? How does the exhaust system work, etc. In the same way, when we talk about anatomy and physiology in regards to living things, anatomy is what the living things are made of, what are the component parts, whereas physiology is how they work. Now, the first subject, the first system that we're going to talk about is the skin. Another name for the skin is the integumentary system. That's the fancy name for skin. The first thing you have to understand here is what do we mean by a system? See, living things are exceptionally organized. If you take a big building, for example, it's just not like put together haphazardly, right? There's a great design to it in a way, the architecture of it, the electrical circuits, the plumbing system, the heating system, etc. So you can study a building, for example, a great mosque or something like that, from very small aspects of it, well, you know, how the windows look, for example, or the big picture view of the building, right? Or you can look at it in a system way. For example, you can study the plumbing system, the electrical system, the ventilation system, etc. So without a doubt, living things are organized. And to help us understand, to kind of categorize our knowledge, we divide the living things into different component parts. The smallest unit of a living thing is called a cell. Cell, by definition, is the smallest unit of life. In other words, anything that is smaller than a cell is not living. So a cell, for example, has nucleus, mitochondria, ribosomes, etc., but they are not living in themselves. So anything that's smaller than a cell is not living. Another way of saying the same thing is that a cell has all the properties of a living thing. Anything that is smaller than a cell does not have the properties of a living thing. Then the natural next question is, and listen carefully, the natural next question is, what are the properties of a living thing? Right? So if cell is the smallest unit of life, and that's a definition that you should know, cell is the smallest unit of life, meaning it is the smallest thing that can be considered to be living in itself. So a cell is the smallest unit of life or living thing. The next question is, what's the definition of a living thing, at least from a science point of view? So what is a living thing? So a living thing has four basic properties. It is born, it grows, it divides, and it interacts with its environment. So a living thing has four basic properties. First, it's born. It did not exist at one time. Second, that it grows. And third, it divides or gives rise to the next generation. Because if it didn't, that would be a very quick end to the species, wouldn't it? So living things are born, they come from other living things. In fact, all cells come from other cells. And they grow. Even the tiniest bacteria, when it's born, is smaller than the parent cell, and then it grows a little bit, even though just a tiny bit. The third thing is that it divides. I mean, it gives rise to other living things, right? Otherwise, as I said, it would be a very short end of that species. And the fourth is not as apparent, and it's trickier for people to remember. And the fourth is that it interacts with its environment. So these are the four basic characteristics of living things. Cells are kind of like bricks in a building, okay? Now, if you want to put bricks together, you just don't stack up bricks. And if you walk into a building that's just, stacked up bricks, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't feel particularly comfortable, right? Stacked up bricks, right? So you put cells and you take some cement, right? And you just take some bricks and you put some cement together and you come up with like a wall. So that's tissue. So tissue is kind of like cells with a little bit of, putting around some stuff around it. So that's tissue. The different types of tissue. There are not that many different types, actually 4 or 5 or 6, depending on how you classify them. If you take different types of tissue, the result is an organ. So heart, for example, or the stomach here, is a bunch of different types of tissues together. Because if you take a piece of chunk from the stomach over here, what you'll see is the stomach cells, but you also see some nerve cells there, right? You'll see some connective tissue there. And then the stomach by itself is just an organ. But if you take stomach and the large intestine, small intestine, all everything together, then you have an organ system. And then if you take different organ systems, such as the cardiovascular system, the pulmonary system, gastrointestinal system, nervous system, you put them all together, then you get an organism. So these are the levels of organization of a living thing. In other words, you can study a living thing from a point of a cell. You can study a living thing from a point of a tissue. You can study a living thing from a point of view of an organ. And you can study a living thing from the point of an organ system. And then, as a whole, as an organism. Now, here's another example, going from a cell to an organ system. So here's a cardiac muscle cell right here. If you take cardiac muscle cell with some surrounding tissue of different types, then you have cardiac muscle tissue. And then if you take different types of tissue, you get an organ. For example, here's the heart. Here's some fat pad around it, right? So organ, like a heart, consists of different types of tissue. But the heart by itself is nothing unless there's arteries and veins, etc., right? So the heart plus all of the vasculature together give you the cardiovascular system. So these are the levels of organization in the human body and in living things. Now, there are different systems. There's a circulatory system, there's a nervous system, there's a respiratory system, there's a digestive system, there's a skeletal system, and there's a muscular system. Okay, so I just wanted to introduce you to some of these systems. There's the respiratory system, the lungs, the urinary system, which is the kidneys and the bladder, the male and female reproductive systems, the integumentary system, which is the skin, the skeletal system, the muscular system, the nervous system, the brain, spinal cord, and all the nerves, the circulatory system, the endocrine system, glands that produce hormones such as insulin, etc., the lymphatic system, and the awesome digestive system. So these are some of the systems that we shall highlight in our studies. Now I gotta tell you something. The previous slide, as you can see, had some sensitive pictures, right? But there's a way of studying these things that you can still do with a great deal of modesty, and that is important. In my own life, I've seen textbooks change. They've become less modest. And that says something about our society. And I've said this many times, that is, the problem with the educational system is not that we don't have enough money. In fact, we're one of the richest countries in the world. It's not that we don't have enough money or resources. By far, and listen to this very, very, very carefully, the problem with our educational system is not that we don't have resources or the money, etc. The problem with the educational system is that we don't have the right attitude to education. And education, without a doubt, it starts with proper manners, or as we call adab. These are very important things. That is, you have to have the right attitude to education. Now, there are stories of scholars. Way before they went to start studying, their parents would take them just so that they could sit with elders and scholars, so that they could learn manners, or that is, the etiquettes of learning. The etiquettes of learning and the manners of learning is more important than the actual learning that takes place. Because in the end, you don't want to have a lot of knowledge and have no character. So you'll see that when we study these things, there is a way of doing it with modesty, and that is important to us, because we are people of excellence. As I have said, there are 4 types of tissues: connective tissues, muscle tissue, epithelial tissue, and nervous tissue. And if you take a piece of stomach over here, for example, you will have components of all of these 4 types of tissue. There will be epithelial tissue, or the inside lining of the stomach. There will be nervous tissue that controls the activity of the stomach. And there's this connective tissue kind of holds everything together like the cement of a building. And there's the smooth muscle tissue which does the work of the stomach. So stomach as an organ is made of different types of tissues, as you can see. And now to a main subject, and that is the integumentary system, or the skin. Now, if you were to take a cross-section of the skin like over here, you can divide it into two parts. One, here's the dermis, and the second, here's the epidermis. The term epi means above. So dermis is kind of like the meat of the skin, the very important part of the skin where there's a lot of structures that are unique to the skin. Epidermis means above the skin, so to speak. So we have dermatologists. These are skin doctors. We don't call them epidermatologists, do we? So there are dermatologists, right? So dermis is like kind of a very important part of the skin. In fact, it's really only the basal layer, the very beginning layer of the epidermis right here that's actually alive, so to speak. And as the cells migrate towards the outer part of the skin, they start to die. In fact, the very top part of the skin is just basically dead cells filled with protein. So the skin broadly can be classified into the dermis and the epidermis. Now the tissue that's below the dermis is called the subcutaneous layer, the subcutaneous tissue, or sometimes called the hypo, or beneath the dermis, or hypodermis. So broadly the skin can be divided into these three layers: dermis, epidermis, and subcutaneous tissue. Now, you have to have a healthy respect for the skin because it does a lot of things for us. For example, it protects us against heat and cold, right? It protects us from mechanical trauma, right? And it protects us even from chemical injury as long as it's mild, right? It protects us from germs coming into us, correct? It also helps us make certain things, vitamin D, for example. Part of the synthesis of vitamin D requires sunlight and happens in the skin. Now, skin, you'll see, has sweat glands that produce sweat. It's kind of like, a waxy thing that prevents dehydration. That's one of the functions of sweat. Now, skin also has a lot of nerve endings that help us sense different things. For example, we can sense pressure, vibration, pain, heat, etc., right? So skin has a lot of nerve endings. So skin has a lot of functions. It protects us from an environment, mechanical injury, chemical injury. It protects us from the gazillions of bacteria and microorganisms that are out there, right? It helps us make vitamin D. It helps prevent dehydration. And it has a lot of sensory nerve endings and receptors that help us sense and interact with our environment. Here's again the diagram of the skin, and we shall study it in slightly more detail. As we said, this is the dermis. Now, dermis has this over here, that's the sweat gland. Now, one feature that's particularly dramatically demonstrated over here is the vasculature. You see, the blood vessels are located in the subcutaneous tissue over here. Arteries and veins, so to speak, or small arteries or veins, which are known as arterioles. Now, they give branches off more up over here like this. Now, one key concept that you have to understand, that anything that's living requires blood in the body. So any tissue that is alive will need blood. So anywhere you see that is blood vessel, that means that tissue is alive. Now you can see here that in the epidermis there is no blood vessel. You see any blood vessels over there? I don't see no blood vessels over there, because that tissue does not require blood. Now the tissue over here needs blood because the very last layer over here, the cells over here, are alive. Okay? So they're getting the oxygen and nutrients from the blood over here. But as the cells migrate, the farther away from the blood they get, they start dying off. Okay? One, because they don't have any blood supply, right? And secondly, that's their job, because by the time they're here, they're just dead cells. So the top, very top layer of the skin is actually protein-filled dead cells that protect us. Okay? So as you can see here, then the blood vessels go all the way up into those hills and valleys there. And they supply the basal layer here of the epidermis. Now this is a hair follicle. Now our hair is also dead tissue, right? So our hair is basically dead cells. But that's the very top of the hair, okay? Because when you cut hair, it grows back, right? But the growth occurs over here. See, there are new cells being formed over here, and the cells migrate up over like this. And again, just like in the epidermis, as the cells migrate up, they start dying. But these cells are alive, and they need blood. Therefore, you can see the blood vessels going over there. Now, the hair follicle is associated with the special oil glands. Now these are different from these glands over here, which are sweat glands. So we have two different types of glands. Now sweat has several functions. One is to protect us from dehydration. The other, for example, is to control our body temperature. So hair has its own oil glands or sebaceous glands. So sebaceous glands are associated with hair follicles. So they make this oily stuff that goes over here that people have on their hair. Now hair follicles are associated with this interesting muscle right here. This is look at the size of this muscle, okay? This is a hair. So this is a tiny, tiny muscle right here, okay? Now this muscle is responsible for giving us goosebumps. When hairs stand up, right? That's goosebumps, right? That's because there's a tiny muscle that tugs on them and makes them straight. That's known as the erector pili muscle or hair erector muscle, the goosebumps muscle that makes our hair stand up. There's one more thing I wanted to suggest to you over here. No muscle moves in the body without having a nerve supply. It's the nerves that come from the brain that actually tells muscles to move. And nerves are actually yellow here in this diagram, and that's a nerve that's going to the erector pili muscle. Now there's another thing I want to bring to your attention is this structure over here. That's actually a pressure sensor, how we can sense pressure and touch. That's a very unique structure. Now here's the epidermis in greater detail. So all of this from here to here is the epidermis. This layer over here is very important. That's the basal layer that's giving rise to all of these cells that migrate over here. Now as the cells climb up over here, they lose their components and eventually they basically become dead cells over here. Now previously, as you can see, there are hills and valleys over here in the basal layer like this. Now it is those hills and valleys that gives our particular fingerprints. So the fingerprints result from the redipegs or those valleys that occur in the skin, and they're very unique. Now this cell over here that looks kind of like an octopus type of cell with these tentacles going over here like this is very important because that is a melanocyte. A melanocyte is a cell that produces the pigment melanin, and melanin is what gives us our skin color. So melanocytes actually produce the pigment and they kind of donate it to all of the cells that are surrounding over here. The other cells, in fact, they don't produce the pigment. Now this is a histology picture, that is, this is skin under the microscope. So here's the basal layer. And as you can see, as the cells travel over here, they lose their nuclei, and if you don't have nuclei, that cell is dead. Now this slide highlights the melanocyte. So here's a melanocyte over here producing the pigment. And then as you can see, it gives the pigment to the surrounding cells over here. The individuals that have lighter skin, they just make less pigment. Again, I just wanted to bring to your attention the sebaceous gland is different from the sweat gland over here. Now I like this picture because it kind of shows you the arteries and veins over here in the subcutaneous tissue, how they're kind of like under the carpet of the skin, so to speak. Dermis, epidermis, and subcutaneous tissue. Now melanocytes are pretty easy to spot actually because ironically under the microscope they look white over here. Now we shall talk about some pathology of the skin. Pathology meaning disease. Melanoma is a type of a skin cancer. There are different types of skin cancers. Melanoma is one of them, and it's important to recognize because it actually can be quite dangerous. So if you know this stuff, you can actually help save somebody's life perhaps, inshallah, because you can spot this. A simple definition of cancer is cells that have lost the ability to control their growth. In other words, cancer just keeps growing. So cancer cells are cells that divide too much. And cancer does not have to be very big to cause big trouble. A small cancer located strategically can cause very big trouble. For example, a cancer that's around a blood vessel feeding a vast area, and if it occludes the blood vessel, compromises the blood supply to that region, and it can cause big trouble. So there's A, B, C, D of skin lesion. That is, when you're trying to evaluate a skin lesion, you can try to remember these four things. First, you look for asymmetry. That is, in distinguishing a benign lesion from a malignant lesion. Benign meaning harmless and malignant meaning cancerous or causing trouble. So in trying to distinguish between a benign lesion and a malignant lesion, you can look for these four things. One is asymmetry. A benign lesion tends to be symmetrical, and a malignant lesion tends to be asymmetrical. A benign lesion will have even edges, whereas a malignant lesion will have uneven edges. A benign lesion tends to have one shade of color. A malignant lesion can have two or more shades of color. Here you can see a darker area, and here you can see a lighter area. And finally, diameter greater than 6 millimeters. So if a lesion is bigger than 6 millimeters, statistically it tends to be more likely to be malignant. So if a lesion is asymmetrical, and if its borders or edges are uneven, and if it has more than one shade of color, and if it's larger than 6 millimeter, that's a cause for concern and needs to be evaluated. So you got to know this: A, B, C, D of skin lesions. Asymmetry, border, color, and diameter. Now, when somebody cuts their skin, there's a break in the skin occurs. So this shows the healing process when there's injury to the skin. So if there's a wound over here, right, the blood vessels break, right? That's why we bleed, because there's a trauma to the blood vessel, and the blood just kind of spills out. So blood has this very amazing phenomenon that is a liquid solution inside the blood vessels. But as soon as it leaves the blood vessel, it becomes solid. Someday you must ask me why that's the case. The first thing to happen is that the blood clots. Here it is. And then, as part of the regenerative process, the basal layer of the skin grows over here like this, right? And there's a lot of healing that occurs. And eventually, this break is healed like this, and the scar tissue that's being formed. And in the end, you will have new skin, regenerated epithelium, and there's some scar tissue. If the break is minor, the healing can be so effective that you can't even tell. Okay, so that's our survey of integumentary system. Until next time, as-salatu was-salamu ala rasulillah walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum.